He's suffocating, right? So he's just a the attacks. There we are. The attacks against George Soros, I think, are a distraction. I think you've got people like James O'Keefe coming out and saying it's George Soros, it's George Soros, it's George Soros. The response from the left is it's the George Soros trope, it's the George Soros trope. And they've created a rhythm between the two of them. The left is effectively able to ignore it because it defines it as a trope. Once something becomes defined as a trope, it becomes containable. It becomes encyclopedic. You can go to your catalog, section B, paragraph 22. Aha, the George Soros trope. And because it's been cataloged, because it's been crystallized as a meme, it's not something we have to think about critically anymore. It's something that the intelligent people at Snopes.com have already figured it out. They've already categorized it. They've already debunked it, right? It's like any of these things. It's like the idea that the Earth is flat. That's a trope. People continue to push it and push it and push it, and we don't need to investigate it. Every time we hear that claim, we don't need to critically investigate it. Or the idea that evolution never happens. We don't need to critically actually, okay, that's a proposition. Let me step by step go back to first principles and decode that. And so the use of tropism, meaning the categorization of tropes and effectively shutting down critical thinking, is actually a necessary part of our attentionality. Meaning we can't constantly look at the world with fresh eyes every single day. We have to build a body of knowledge and authority to work off and to work on. When somebody says the Earth is flat, or someone says evolution doesn't happen, or somebody says George Soros has a conspiracy, all of these kinds of tropes, some of them you might agree with, some of them you might disagree with, whatever. But tropism as a psychological mechanism allows us to prevent the entropic release of mental energies onto a chaotic field of information. We have to do this. We have to use tropes. We have to say, okay, you're a blank blank. We'll put a label on you. We'll put a label on your idea. We're going to box it off. We're going to categorize it. That kind of thinking is the basis of science. It's required for any kind of advance of knowledge. It's required for any kind of success in terms of, not having a Groundhog Day effect with Bill Murray, where you're just again and again and again, okay, well, I heard this argument yesterday, but let me reconsider it, right? So tropism itself is something that's necessary. It's part of the necessity of authority. That, there's this trendy libertarian thing where the right wing will say, well, we have to question everything. It's like, okay, well, to a limit, right? If you question everything, then all you have is questions, you don't have any answers. If you don't have any answers, then you can't do anything. That's the idea that we should question everything is just as paralyzing as believing in falsehoods. And sometimes more so. Sometimes you believe a falsehood, like let's say you believe the Earth is a perfect sphere. The Earth is not a perfect sphere. But if you believe that, it's probably better to believe the Earth is a perfect sphere than to live in a state of constant questioning about the state of the shape of the Earth. Or even to believe the Earth is flat. Like if you truly believe the Earth is flat, in a sense, it might be better for you to believe it's flat than to be constantly in this existential crisis of what is the shape of the Earth and how can we really know the shape of the Earth. At some point, you have to put these doubts and questions beside yourself, and you have to accept some kind of authority. Now, the authorities we're even capable of accepting are always going to be limited by our own perceptions of authority. Even if an authority was perfect and could theoretically tell us everything perfectly, would we be able to receive that? Well, think about when you were in school. The younger you are, the better the metaphor works. You might have had a teacher who was teaching you the correct things. Now, when it came time for the test, did you perfectly reproduce the answers that the teacher told you? Probably not. Unless you were a perfect student, you probably messed up, right? Even though that we're in this model, in this metaphor, we're assuming that the teacher has perfect knowledge, whether it's history, mathematics, science, doesn't matter. The teacher has perfect knowledge. The teacher is trying to communicate that knowledge. But you, because you're an imperfect receiver of authority, it doesn't matter how perfect the authority is, at some point there's a limit. I always give the example of a dog in calculus. You could have a perfect math teacher who can perfectly teach calculus, and if you have a golden retriever or something, you can really try hard to learn those tricks, but learning calculus is probably a bridge too far. So you can have a perfect authority, but most of the time what people fall up against is not, oh no, the authority was imperfect, or oh no, the authority was problematic. Usually what people run into, I think the most common basic problems that we actually have control over is our perception of authority. How able are we to follow authority? How able are we to discipline ourselves to be in accordance with authority? I've gotten far off and away from the George Soros topic. George Soros is portrayed by the right wing as a criminal. And that word criminal is important because it means he is a lawbreaker or an exception against the system. And therefore, the framing of George Soros as a criminal and as an exception to the system implies that the system is good, the system works, the system is valid, and the system should continue. But that George Soros is a criminal and he's just messing everything up. He's throwing a wrench in what would otherwise be a perfectly good society. The idea that religiously, our society is okay. Politically, our system's okay. Everything works just fine. Criminal justice, it's mediocre, but it's all right. I mean, pretty much down the line, when you say things like George Soros is a criminal, that's implying that the system as a whole represents a system of law and order, and that George Soros represents an exception to the system. And that's just not true, right? So all of the things that George Soros is accused of doing, I don't even care about those claims. I don't even care whether they're valid or invalid. I care about the moral field that surrounds the claims itself. So if we say that, George Soros is promoting a religion of racial resentment, I don't know if that's true or not, and I don't really care. What I care about is this labeling of George Soros as a criminal because he's funding Black Lives Matter. That's the claim that's made. And implicit in that claim is the idea that without this nefarious Loki trickster god George Soros, everything would be working just fine. We wouldn't have any racial resentments in society. We would be religiously at peace. Everything would be just fine. Implying that if you just took this one man, this one demonous villain who lives in a cave under a volcano or something, if you could just remove him from the equation, then we would have something that works well. And again, this is something that is really necessary in terms of propaganda, is if you want people to get mad about something, if you want people to get emotional, if you want a narrative, it has to be mythic. And in a mythic narrative, you can't say things like, this system is broken. Because if you say something like the system is broken, that's not actionable. A system is ambiguous. A system is abstract, right? We cannot emotionally invest in questions of the system or abstract questions in general. That's not something that you can really get excited about, even if it's more accurate than to say, it's George Soros' fault. He is the Loki. He is the deceiver. He is the big Satan, right? So we can look at pictures of him. We can think of him in our mind. It's a very powerful tactic to use this imagination, the way we are able to attach moral judgments to faces of people. This is very powerful. And so because this is such a powerful technique in propaganda. It leads to this bias of people thinking that it's George Soros and Mr. President, can you please, sanction him, or can you please, they did this in Hungary, right? They did this in Hungary where they said, we're going to shut down George Soros University. And people have been observing, I've been observing the situation in Hungary since, 2014? I've been looking at Hungary. And I'm always very skeptical when they do these big, flashy things like this. These big, flashy things. I'm always questioning, what's the undergirding system? What is the religious framework of our society? The problem I have with people who say we just need to go, back to the King James, we just need Stephen Anderson, we just need, faith alone, we just need, to read our Bibles. It's not saying that it's wrong to read the Bible, but when you say we're just going to do that alone, we're going to throw out everything we've gained, everything that's developed, we're going to throw out evolution, we're going to throw out globalism, right? We're just going to throw it out. It's like it's a piece of trash that someone dropped out the car window, we're just going to throw it out. We're just going to get rid of it. That is, to me, not a solution. It's not a way forward. It's not even a way backward. It's kind of an imaginary desire to go backwards, but it's not. It doesn't actually represent something that's real. And that, I guess I have a problem with that kind of self-deception that then metastasizes and spreads, and like a cancer. You see it in comment sections of people, posting the same thing over and over again. It's like, Holy Roman Empire avatar, read the Bible, repeat after me, repeat the catechism after me, ignore evolution, ignore globalism, just ignore it, just throw it in the trash. It's not understanding that the religious framework that we're living in is a shifting sea. And when we look historically, we can understand that evolution doesn't just work genetically. This is an interesting thing where, of course, you'll get the real extreme people who will just deny evolution outright and just say it doesn't happen. We can see evolution happening before our eyes, because evolution doesn't just take place with genetic information. Genetic information is a place where obviously evolution can happen. But evolution also takes place memetically, and it takes place with religions. Religions evolve over the time. Religions are not these static entities. Religions are going to change. And so if we're thinking about religions as this static object, if we're thinking about a religion as like, it's an assortment. Do you remember back in the Renaissance, I don't know exactly the time period, I know it was post-Renaissance, post-1400s, they would paint these still life pictures. You would have the pear and the apple. Sometimes they'd draw a little fly, well, they paint it, but they paint a little fly on there, perfect little fly specimen. They might put in some kind of candles. It would be a still life image. A still life image was meant to represent this non-dynamical system. Camille Paglia refers to sort of the Apollonian sense, that there's these contours and these lines and the shading, and everything is what it is. It's this eternal image, this eternal object you can focus on. And that provides a kind of safety, because it provides a kind of familiarity and a kind of stability that people are seeking after, because that to them is their shelter from death. And death creates this dynamic, and death creates this falling and this rising. And so people want to escape death, and so they're latching on to the idea of, okay, well, we're going to imagine some kind of perfect system, like the Bible is a perfect system. There's only one way to interpret it. It was that way in the beginning. It'll be that way at the end of the time. That's kind of there's this kind of monotheistic urge to hone in on some kind of singularity of unity, that's something that we desire. And there's something important about that. There's almost something that we could criticize that urge in people, but it is an urge that people have. As much as we can criticize in ourselves or others urges that we have. We have urges for food we shouldn't eat. We have urges for sexuality. We have urges to be lazy. We have these urges, and we could criticize it. We could say, oh, well, it just shouldn't exist. On some level, it has to be satisfied. On some level, we have to have a culinary culture that is sustainable, right? That doesn't just have everybody on a 5% body fat diet. People can achieve it. Is it really sustainable for a population? No. Some people can be celibate their whole lives. It's possible. I believe people have done it. Is that possible for the population at large? No. Some people can just be on a 4-hour a night sleep schedule or Superman sleep schedule. People can do all kinds of crazy things. Is that sustainable for the majority of the population? No. So in all of these things, even if we try to deny the reality of, and we might even frame this, the Heraclitean view, everything changes, versus what sort of then becomes and I'm forgetting who's the opposition to Heraclitus, but you've got then it kind of goes into Platonism and monotheism with this idea that everything stays the same. And when you have these two views, we can obviously see that it's just not true that religion is this object that we can latch onto and hold fast to, especially given the context of the times. When the context of the times is very much parallel or a reflection of, or as George Lucas would say, we've got rhyming verses here with the early Christian period, where you had this huge religious inversion going on between polytheism and monotheism. It went back and forth for centuries. There was no real clear answer for centuries. It was very dynamic. And then finally you had some sort of stability after, I guess, the collapse of Rome. You had some sort of stability religiously. Now, demographically, the Germans were running around and ransacking everybody, and the Vikings were running around and ransacking everybody, and then the Muslims came around, they started ransacking everybody. So, was that actually very stable? When you look at the Great Migration period with the Vikings, with the Germans, with the Arabs, basically from the collapse of Rome up until, the Muslim expansion continued for quite a while. But then, you're coming to the investiture contest. The point is that, history doesn't stop, and religion is a fundamental part of history. I started to read through this argument for free speech today. And when we look at things on an evolutionary basis and we assume that things have to change and we have to continue to evolve and we can't just go back, then there is a necessity for some kind of freedom of speech, right? If you have some kind of absolute thought dictatorship where everything has been categorized and everything has been made into an authoritarian one-party doctrine down to your haircut and your favorite color, and everything is uniform, then obviously you come to a place of stagnation where it's very difficult to survive in a changing world. On the other hand, there was no freedom of speech under Christianity. When Christianity was a dominant religion, you couldn't blaspheme against Christ. The idea that somehow you can claim to be a free speech absolutist and a Christian at the same time, you're either lying about one of those things. Either you're not a free speech absolutist and you're just using that term in a very, in a tactical way, I suppose. I'm a free speech absolutist. Also, you shouldn't be able to say bad things about Jesus, or you shouldn't be able to denigrate Jesus. Well, then that's not really absolute free speech, right? And on the other hand, if you say, "Oh, I think you should be able to say anything you want about Jesus, and I'm a Christian," well, then you're not a real Christian. It's those two things are contradictory. But I guess people don't really care about that at the end of the day. It's more about the branding. Maybe the branding is more important than the logical consistency. We have a dynamical free speech system. We have a problem of authority. We're trying to find some kind of sweet spot where things can change just enough that we can kind of ride this wave, and we don't, like a surfer on a wave, you have to kind of move along with the system and not get swept under by the ocean. So we're trying to ride the wave, but at the same time, we're trying to find these kind of static loci, meaning locations. We're trying to find these static locus of authority that can orient us toward a directionality, because we don't know what's down, up, northwest, southeast. We don't know what direction we're going in or where we should be heading. So there is at some point, I think, a necessity for some, and I think the history of religion proves that people really do need to be able to reduce things to a kind of absolute simplicity that we call God or, nirvana or whatever. But we have to be able to produce something or reduce reality to some sort of absolute simplicity, that this is necessary, that this is a kind of refuge from the world. And there are some people who are going to spend their entire lives dedicating to seeking this refuge of God or nirvana, and they're going to be completely absorbed, and that's all they're going to do. And what those people then act as kind of a mediating force between that refuge and the population at large, because the population at large is not spending their entire lives in spirituality. The population at large is just going about daily business, taking care of their daily needs, and their wants and their desires as well. But every now and then again, and maybe on a weekly basis, they need to hit the reset button. They need to come back to a kind of absolute simplicity. And in order to do that, they might go visit a priest, or they go and visit a temple. They make contact. They come up. They do not necessarily enter into the mindset of the priest himself, but they become adjacent to it. They sort of rub up against it, and this allows them to take all of the infinite complexity of the world and the stress and the negativity and all those things that become unmanageable, and it allows them to sort of offload them onto this holy object of the priest and of the temple and of these things. And so the population at large doesn't necessarily have spiritual experiences or make direct contact with God, but they become adjacent to those who attempt to do that in a hierarchical function. So it's necessary to have people who are really of a mindset, who are not thinking in terms of evolution all the time, who are not thinking of like, how can we beat the system, or how can we do this, or how can we do that. They're just seeking that absolute simplicity. They're not doing anything else. The problem, I think, is when people start to confuse the function of seeking absolute simplicity, which is necessary for the functioning of society because of our psychological needs, but that is not necessarily the approach that's going to work in terms of like politics, right? If you're approaching politics with the mindset of anti-evolution, absolute simplicity, is that really going to work? It is an oversimplification to say that George Soros is the problem. The problem is a little more fundamental. The problem is a little bit more complex at the same time. And it's not reducible to a single person. George Soros is an old guy. If he dies, which would be very unfortunate, if he dies, the system's not going to change, right? He is a personality. He's like a comic book character that people latch onto, that people look at and they say, aha, there is the man behind all of our problems. But he doesn't matter so much whether he comes or goes. All of his money at this time is basically tied up in institutions, or it's going to be inherited by his kids, or the government might tax it, inheritance tax, and they'll have it. But all of those three categories, the institutions, his children, the government, they're all headed in the same direction. So asking, when you have a system, it's a fundamentally religious system, and it's pushing us in this direction, is it useful to scapegoat a man like George Soros? Is it useful when you're not reaching the left, because the left has already created a trope about that? You're also reinforcing the idea on the right wing that, like, Donald Trump is your friend and he's going to save you, in which people invest a lot of time and energy, which is limited. We don't have infinite time and energy. If we had infinite time and energy and we could say, okay, well, we're going to support people who are useless and don't help us at all because we have infinite time and energy, so why not just support everybody? But we actually don't. We actually don't. And it doesn't mean that we have to then do the inverse, which is to constantly complain about Trump or to constantly campaign against him, right? It's almost, you reach a state of apathy. It's a selective apathy. It doesn't mean apathy about everything, but it means you pick your battles. You see, okay, where are we diverting energy that is not useful? Is it useful to create a documentary or some kind of mini expose about how George Soros, I mean, how many articles have been written? How many Republican, this is the kind of thing that tells me this is actually counterproductive. When you see Republican senators and congressmen calling out George Soros, it kind of, a light bulb goes off in my head like, perhaps this is a counterproductive, I mean, if they're doing it, it's probably something that's not really great to do, right? It's probably not something that is progressive in terms of moving the conversation forward. It's probably just saying, my Republicans are calling out George Soros, therefore he's where we should direct our attention, instead of just seeing him as a facet and even a product of the system that we have. That there's something deeper at work here. It's not simply a caricature that we can demonize and scapegoat and say, okay, well, we get rid of him. He's old. He's going to die soon anyway. I mean, he can't live forever, right? So what happens next? Does everything go back to sunshine and happiness and roses? Or is it actually a bit bigger than that? And as much as I can criticize the idea of simply going back to the Bible, some kind of conservative or traditionalist interpretation, and these kind of suggestions, as much as I can criticize it, we can still find value in the Christian worldview, the Christian perspective, the Christian attitude toward the world, which is that the world, for the early Christians, was controlled by the Romans, who are this gigantic polytheist heathen empire that persecutes them, that is against them. And they're just living in this empire that hates them and wants to destroy them. And their attitude is not one of despair. Their attitude is not one where they say, we should just give up, or we should just join the system, or, we should stop this, or we should whatever. They have an attitude, they have a fanatical attitude that there's something necessary about the situation, that it's not the human impossibility of the situation, that is, no individual human could have changed the Roman Empire. It was so much bigger than one individual human. They identified, they said that the church and the body of Christ were synonymous. So it wasn't about any individual disciple or prophet or any one person was going to change it. It was collectively that they were going to hunker down, they were going to survive Nero, they're going to survive these persecutions, and then out of that, through just survival, like if you survive long enough, and I think you see this in the Jewish people as an aside, or you can say even more broadly, If you just hunker down and you survive long enough, it's kind of the opposite of what's the statistic? It's like the phrase is something like, in the end, everyone has 100% death rate, or in the end, everything fails. But on the other hand, if you just survive long enough, like eventually you come out on top. Because, when you think about like a Spenglerian cycle, like civilization structures, institutions, no matter how well they're built, they all have a kind of expiration date. So you don't need to. It's like when a bear is chasing you. The bear represents death and chronology and time and entropy, and your mistakes and consequences catching up to you. You might be happy today, and you're doing drugs and you're happy, and then you're going to feel the consequences down the line, but not today, right? So the bear represents time and death, and the bear's chasing everybody. And you don't need to be faster than the bear. You just need to be faster than the slower guy behind you. So in a sense, Christianity didn't take the attitude of, how are we going to win in the next 10 years? How are we going to win in the next 100 years? How are we going to win? How are we going to defeat this? How are we going to be in a position where we're not the underdog anymore, where we're the establishment, we're the authority? Because that eventually did happen. But they weren't necessarily framing things in that kind of black and white win or fail situation. They just said, we have to survive. We have to create communities that are reproducible, that are strong, that are capable sometimes of practicing kinds of crypsis, also infiltrating the army. A lot of military members were Christian. Also cozying up to the aristocracy, having an intelligentsia that's having these arguments with pagans and epistles. We're going to be engaged in this activity. We're going to survive. And eventually the Roman system, as powerful as it was, and as much as we can look at it as a really supreme system, it eventually did degenerate, and it eventually did fall. And as it was, Christianity had an opportunity to make those inroads. And there was a shaky back and forth, and you had Constantine and Marcus Aurelius, and then things sort of bubble up to that critical point where there's a shift, and now finally you've got people like Charlemagne, and that at that point we've reached a completely new era. But it took a long time, and so people who, it's not even necessarily like the early Christians were thinking, okay, if we just continue this strategy, maybe in 1,000 years we'll win. That wasn't even necessarily the attitude or the thought process or the projection. It wasn't even so much a plan of like, here's how we're going to accomplish this on this time scale. It was an attitude of, we're going to survive, we're going to do everything to thrive. People who, and it said in the Bible all these times, the disciples did not believe. I think is it Peter who walks out of the boat onto the water because Jesus is walking on the water, and he says, Lord, call me out to you. And so Peter gets out of the boat. I think it's Peter. Anyway, one of the disciples, he starts walking out to Jesus, and then he gets spooked. He starts to doubt, and he starts sinking. So you have all these stories in the Bible about how the disciples constantly were doubting. They were constantly being like, oh, what if something bad happens? What if we can't win? And constantly, over and over again, this, I think, is one of the most important system of parables in the New Testament, that it just talks about how, even the strongest and the most intelligent and the closest to Jesus, they were always constantly doubting, and that was their downfall. And you just have to never, never, never doubt. And you have to never just ask that question of like, oh, what if our best isn't enough? Right? That, I think that it's maybe not the biggest sin in the Bible, but I think that's something that there was a heavy emphasis in their attitude of, it's actually sinful to ask this question, what if we don't win? What if the Romans kill us all? What if this happens? What if that happens? What if the heretics win? I don't know. You don't have that attitude. You don't live your life in such a way of constantly questioning yourself. Once you arrive at the doctrine or the system or the charismatic leader, or once you arrive into that path, you kind of dedicate yourself to that path, and you don't ask the question, are we there yet? You don't say, how much longer do we have to walk? And what if a bear comes and eats us? And, all these things. What if we run out of food? You just keep walking the path. And if you keep walking that path, you eventually succeed. And I don't know how, and you don't even question how long it's going to take. That's not even a problem. That's not even something that enters into your mind. That attitude's very powerful. It doesn't, for me, say that, because frankly, it's just not convincing. There are a lot of ideologies that have this. We can say there are elements of liberalism that have this attitude of, we still live in a white supremacist society, but we just keep going. Christians, obviously, who say that, well, Christianity has been declining for hundreds of years, but we just keep going. There are probably other groups like this, but I think those are the big two, that they have this attitude, and this attitude at some level is necessary. From top to bottom, you have to have the rank and file who think in this way. You have to have the people at the top who think this way. We keep walking the path and we eventually succeed. The problem with that, of course, is if walking the path, if your compass is bad or the path you've got is leading you off a cliff, then obviously your absolute faith in the righteousness of that path, it's leading you to destruction. So then you kind of need some kind of, at least initially, prior to picking the path, you need to have some kind of orientation, some kind of compass, some kind of logic or reason or rationality where you can discern between those different paths and choose the best one, because there's a lot out there. It's not just a Pascal's wager of, well, you've got God and then you've got atheism and you just choose one or the other, and it's a kind of, Pascal's wager makes sense if it's just you've got God and atheism. But if you've got many different paths, then it becomes a bit more difficult. And so that constant struggle between do you simplify everything to just it's all about George Soros? Because I think that's a path to destruction. I think simplifying everything and just saying it's this one guy, not thinking of the bigger picture, not thinking more fundamentally, I think that is a path to destruction. But on the other hand, if we only question, if we simply say, okay, well, it's not good to criticize George Soros, well, then what's the alternative? You can't just take away. People have a need for mythology. They have a need for characters. This is why people like movies. They like video games. They like characters. They like identifiable personalities that they can imbue into a moral mythology. They need that. So if you say, okay, well, we can't criticize George Soros anymore because that's unproductive, then what's going to replace that? What mythology? Is it just going to be an abstraction? Because most people can't handle that. Even very smart people, I think, can't necessarily handle that because it's an emotional need. It's not just a question of intellectuality. Are you able to do a difficult math problem? You can have someone who is completely capable of doing high-level abstraction, but emotionally, that doesn't motivate them. Just doing high-level abstraction, unless you're like very, there's some people who just do math problems all day. But even if you're very intelligent, I think people have an emotional need to have a mythology, to have a clear, simplistic, and anthropomorphic idea of the world. We need personalities, and this is, in a sense, like we can't be godless. Like you can't be an atheist. You can't believe that consciousness is an illusion and that God doesn't exist. When the people who claim to do that still engage in this anthropomorphizing of politics and economics, when these things are not, strictly speaking, reducible to single personalities. But the left does it with Trump, and the right does it with George Soros, and so this is like a human necessity. So then what do you replace it with? If it's not George Soros, who do you replace it with? I guess my tentative answer has been something like you replace it with those who are ostensibly the good billionaires. You look at that. It's very difficult because of the way, think about how Mark Zuckerberg presents himself, or Bill Gates, or who is the late Steve Jobs. they wear like sweater vests, or Mark Zuckerberg will wear t-shirts and jeans. They intentionally present themselves as inoffensively as possible. They present themselves as not powerful, and so they're not compelling. George Soros at least has the good sense to wear a suit, right? So because George Soros wears his suit, it's easier for us to imagine him as a powerful man, and therefore to get emotional about his power, because there's a kind of energy there that we can react to. We can bounce off of it, right? If you throw a bouncy ball at concrete, the bouncy ball flies up. If you throw a bouncy ball at a piece of clay or a patch of grass or a plot of sand, the bouncy ball doesn't bounce very high because it doesn't meet any resistance. George Soros, because he presents himself, he's got the hands folded and he's got the suit on, therefore he presents a powerful image, and that's a kind of concrete energy that it's something solid that we can bounce off of and have our own reactionary energy. But someone like Zuckerberg or someone like Gates or someone like Jobs, where they present themselves as like this weird fusion of hippie and nerd, and they're inoffensive. Elon Musk does this in a way as well. This is something that is obvious to anyone. It's something that they're intentionally doing. They're intentionally making themselves seem unimportant, not very powerful, not very influential. And so they intentionally make it difficult to create mythological narratives around them that moralize people and mobilize people into not necessarily action itself, not even necessarily like when the early Christians would demonize Nero, for example. It's not that they were able to do anything against him specifically, but that their hatred of Nero was able to then be channeled as an energetic activity into day-to-day life. It's I guess interesting the way that if you don't kind of have a cast of characters, what did Shakespeare say? All of life is theater, all of life is a play, and we're the players. That is so important. The theatrics of religion and politics are so important that we have not just identifiable people that we can focus energy on and actually generate energy out of, but that we have, but that these people be compelling characters in a storybook. This is how the mind thinks, and I guess this is the point at which I look at literature and storytelling and the arts and theater and the English major and this kind of thinking as very important, because this is about crafting narratives. This is about understanding almost on an intuitive level and trying to create some kind of internal structure of language that you can communicate with people, not just facts and data and statistics, but do it in a way that's compelling. And the question becomes, what are you compelling them towards? Are you compelling them toward donating to your Patreon? Are you compelling them toward taking action? Are you compelling them toward changing their habits and changing the way that they live their lives? So there are a lot of people who are very compelling at crafting narratives. Like a Joe Rogan will craft narratives, and he'll present narratives to people, and those are very compelling, and that's why people watch his show, and so he has a very large audience. Now, is he directing his audience in a way that is impactful in the world, that really changes the world? And maybe in some cases you can make the argument that he is, but on the other hand, you could have somebody whose intention is not just merely to garner a large audience, as I think implicitly that's kind of what Joe is doing, but then there are other people who their concern is not mere quantity and money. Joe has signed this Spotify deal, which I think, to me, I don't have Spotify. I'm not going to listen to Joe on Spotify. If he's not on YouTube, I'm never going to hear from Joe again. So in a sense, you can kind of see where Joe's head and where Joe's heart are at. There are other people who would say, my goal is not to gain a quantitative audience and therefore to gain a lot of money. My goal is to craft a narrative, to craft a message that's going to be as impactful as possible, qualitatively impacting people's lives. Whether that has a large audience or not is not really the concern. The intention is, if you could change one person's life 180 degrees, that would be superior to changing everyone's lives 1 degree, right? Or an insignificant amount, or not at all. So this is, I think, the problem. I think this is why it's necessary, I suppose, to not just consider things in terms of abstraction, or if you do, as an initial step of understanding reality, there has to be a conversion process away from simply a scientific, quantitative view of the world. You have to be able to mythologize that way. You have to be able to communicate that to people. If you have a perfect understanding of society, you have a perfect understanding of the problems, the only way to gather enough energy to create an impetus to change is through communication. If you have any given problem, let's say there's like a bridge you need to build, you can have the perfect model in your head of how to build that bridge. If you cannot communicate to that to people, if you cannot create a structure of authority or integrate yourself into a structure of authority where you have workers who are actually willing to work for you and to build that bridge, and you can't tell them how to build the bridge is not going to be built. And so at the end of the day, it would be better to have someone who is not the best engineer. They don't have the best model of bridge building, but they are capable of garnering authority. They are capable of compelling people in order to start building something, right? In this case, if you have the choice between the ability to think but no ability to communicate versus the ability to communicate and a little ability to think, I mean, because communication itself is a thinking activity, right? I mean, there's some mental process going on. It's not just some kind of spontaneous, shamanic, it's not like you're a monkey making hoo-hoo-ha. I mean, I guess that's what some music is, right? It's just like monkey noises. It's just like pure emotionality without any undergirding intelligence. I actually question the extent to which, a lot of this pop music, there are a lot of algorithms that go into it, so I question the idea that it's unintelligent, but we can certainly imagine in our heads, we can try to imagine that. But I think it's really you're almost talking about two different faculties, one which is more kind of analytical, the other is more intuitive. And I can't imagine people who have a high analytic ability and they just have zero communication ability. In fact, their ability to communicate is so bad that when they try to tell people the truth, they actually turn people off to the truth because people hear the way that they're presenting it and they're like, I don't want to listen to this guy, right? Let's say someone has the perfect truth, but they're ugly. Let's say they have the perfect truth about diet. They know everything about diet in the world. They've mastered the analytic. They've read all the books, but they're fat. Are you going to listen to them? Let's say somebody, they've got the perfect truth about something, but the way that they speak in a flat monotone like this. They speak in it and they look at their shoes and they speak in a flat monotone. Do you hear what I'm saying here? So if you have access to these perfect truths, kind of going to what I said before about authority, if we imagine truth itself as an authority and we personalize truth as an anthropomorphization, the truth can speak to us, but if we don't have the receptivity to the truth, then we don't obtain any of it. Even if it was transmitted to us, if we don't receive it, we don't obtain it. And if we then try to transmit the truth to others, if we don't do so in a way that is effective, then they don't receive that truth. And it's as if we had never received it in the first place. So in a sense, there's these levels to the truth. There is the truth itself, and then there's ability for us to receive that truth. And then there's the ability for us to communicate that truth. And so if you get down all the way from the truth, the reception, the communication, then you can finally get to a stage where you actually have action is possible based on truth. There's actual possibilities for agency and for change. But if at some place you get stuck in the process, either you weren't receptive to the truth or you weren't able to communicate the truth, then we never get to the point of actionability. I guess there's also an issue where you might communicate the truth and people might believe you and they might accept it, but they are not willing to act on it. They say, yeah, man, you're so right. We should do what you're saying, but I'm kind of scared, you know? Or you watch a YouTube video, dude, this guy is so right. I want to support him. I'm going to do everything for this guy. But then 5 seconds later, you get distracted by another YouTube video. Right, so maybe there's another problem of reception. You've got reception from the truth at the most like abstract level, then communication of the truth, and then you've got a second problem of reception where the truth has been communicated, but it hasn't been received in a way that actually makes the person want to change their behavior. And so I guess it's a cycle between reception, communication, these chains of reception and communication where the truth gets gunked up and it's not able to proceed forth with action and change. That's kind of, I guess, what thinking about George Soros does to me, is it makes me think about, is this an effective mythology? Is this an effective way to communicate ideas so that people change their lives based off this mythology that we're presenting to them? That's my question. And maybe it is the best way. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it is the best way, because I can't think of too many other characters that could replace George Soros, that you would put in his place and you would say these are the enemies. Or perhaps would it be best to, before we try to establish enemies, should we then first establish who are the good people, who are the archetypes that we should follow? And that does rely upon some kind of religious investment in figures, whether they be historical or mythological. Investing in those figures and deciding who they are is something that's important. I'll leave it open-ended for us to think about, for us to consider. There's a lot of contradiction. There's a lot of I've proposed a lot of competing ideas that require some kind of decision. They require some kind of arbitration between them. You have to come down on one side or the other. You have to choose one way or the other. You have to invest yourself in that, because if you're always holding back the investment of time and energy in building something and walking toward a straight path, and you never concentrate and you never focus, and you're always considering all the 360 degrees of options around you, then you actually are stuck in the center. You actually never move out of where you are. You always remain. It's a kind of prison. It's a kind of prison to consider all your options and to never take that leap of faith and say, you know what, I'm just going to go straight and narrow. I'm going to concentrate on this and I'm just going to go for it. If you never do that, then you are simply stuck at square one and you never move. And thus, you are an object. If you don't move, if you don't have agency, if you're not pursuing and concentrating, focusing on something and acting toward a telos, then you are an object. You're no longer a subject. You're not a human being. You're not even a fish. Because that fish move, right? If you don't, in a psychological, in a moral sense, if you're not moving, you're dead, right? We're like the fish. You got to keep moving. If you're not moving, you are an object. You are controlled, right? You're not actually living. To live is to move. And to move is to move toward, with respect to objects in space. And so what are your objects? How do we map out reality in front of us? How do we map out? There's, I guess, a negative model of, you say George Soros is bad, we want to move away from him. There are other people who say Trump is good, we need to move toward him. That is necessary, to have models in your head of people who are real to you. Now, they might not be real to other people. Like, people would say, oh, well, the pagan gods are false and fake. That's what Zoroaster said. Or a lot of people say, well, Jesus is false and fake, and so he's not a real person. But they have to be real to you, right? And that's, I guess, my criticism of paganism, people who want to believe in, like, Odin. It's like, well, do you really believe in him? Do you think of him as a real person? In some sense, ancestor worship, I think, is the most basic religion because we know these are real people. We've met them before, or we have pictures of them, right? We know our ancestors are real. And so, in some sense, worshiping your ancestors or worshiping your descendants, trying to honor them, is probably one of the most basic mythological forms that you can tap into. The issue then is if you don't have some kind of kinship structure that unifies collectively in a communal sense, ancestors and descendants, then it's not actually very effective because it's just an individualistic thing. So that's very important. All of this is kind of pointing toward the idea of kinship and religion, and the two of those being united in some sense into an effective system. How would you do that? You would have to get people living close by because people, well, globalism has changed it a little bit, but people, the idea that, like, there's 7 billion people and one of them is your soulmate, and they might live in India, they might live in Japan, they might live in Nigeria, right? Of course, that's not actually how it works. People are sort of, and maybe there is, I don't know, you could say that people incarnate in localities where they're bound to meet each other or something like that. We could talk about that sort of destiny of locality and incarnation. But ultimately, like, people make connections with the people who are near them. You can say, I'm going to have a long-distance relationship. It might not even be romantic. It might be a friendship. I'm going to be friends with somebody who lives in a different country. You can try that, but it's only going to be analytical, intellectual discussion. It's going to be mediated through technology. It's not going to have the kind of intimacy of the person that you see on a daily basis. In a sense, the person you see on a daily basis, you're going to be more intimate with that person than your best friend who lives far away. So there is a necessity, I think, at some point, if you want to create a religious structure of kinship, you have to be in physical proximity to people. You have to have intimacy with them. You have to see them on a daily basis. You have to have that. There's an almost sensual space-time proximity that's necessary in order for those things to try to form, which is why you'd have in the Bible it says, and every year or 7 years or however long the duration was, everyone in Israel would go to Jerusalem. The entire nation of Israel they'd all show up for a big rally in Jerusalem, which is kind of crazy. If that actually happened, that would be wild. But that's the kind of thing that's necessary, is to have people meeting up like that. That's kind of a precondition. Now, you can say that's not sufficient, but I think it is something that's necessary, that people actually are meeting face to face, getting out of the internet, because the internet's a place where it's very easy to hide and disguise mental illness for years and years and years. And until you actually meet somebody in real life, because people show themselves selectively. I show myself selectively. Everyone shows themselves selectively. It's the Instagram page. Like, you look at the Instagram page, oh, it's all, good food and traveling and beach bodies. It's all good stuff. That doesn't show the other half of it, right? Connor Murphy. He's just going out, and he's a model, and he's a YouTube celebrity, and he's showing us the Solomon complex. He's showing us what happens internally. So you can have people who present themselves one way online. You're never really going to know somebody online until you meet them. You're never going to have that intimacy, and thus you're never going to have trust. And if you don't have trust, you can't invest because you don't trust your investment. And if you don't invest, then you can't build. And if you don't build, then you don't get anywhere. So that's just a bunch of thoughts. We're supposed to talk about George Soros, right? But we went in a different direction. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.